Hello everyone. I'm back, your host, Ashley Rose Young. I'm an American history curator here in the Rare Book Division at the Library of Congress. And just to give you a sense of how things will play out over the next hour or so, I am going to speak for about 8 to 10 minutes about today's theme. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the gorgeous objects that you saw earlier. But before I do that, I want to thank Friends of the Library of Congress for believing in this awesome symposium. They have provided the funding for us to bring this programming to you, so thank you. And I also want to thank my amazing colleagues. I'm getting giddy at this point in the evening. Patrick Hastings, Stephanie Stillo, Stephanie Merkelbach, and Mariana Stell, who are the core team who brought this symposium to you. But there was a group of 20 plus members of people who work here at the Library of Congress who made today possible. So let's give them a round of applause. So this evening, we're going to talk about how we play. And play can take many forms, of course. There's hide and seek, golf, the sport I played in college, football, cards, etc. But we're going to home in on board games tonight. And for some of us, board games ignite a competitive element of our personalities. For others, cooperative tendencies. And sometimes a little bit of both, depending on the game that we're playing. I want to zoom in, though, on the theme of cooperation, or perhaps symbiosis, if we're sticking with the larger theme of nature. As I've stepped into my new role here at the library, I've been here about 10 months now, I've been learning about the history of the book and how books are made. And I've also been learning from our guest speakers, like Elizabeth Hargrave, about other topics, including how board games are made. And I'll tell you what, there's quite a few parallels between books and board games. So just as the history of the book is also a history of printers and paper makers, engravers and binders, the history of board games is also that of designers, artists, manufacturers, and playtesters all working together to transform ideas into a shared experience. While Elizabeth is going to walk us through board game design, I want to take a few moments to dive a bit deeper into the history of how books are made. And given our overarching theme for the symposium, let's explore some works of natural history. So in the display preceding the session, we shared Thomas Say's American Entomology, which included the first depiction of the monarch butterfly published in North America. Across his career, Say detailed over 1,500 insects, 1,000 of which had never been described before in Western science. And he is just one of dozens and dozens of natural scientists whose work is covered in our collections. People who have dedicated their lives to increasing our knowledge of the natural world. Everything from mushrooms and mollusks to trees and tarantulas. And many of these books do not simply depict nature. They attempt to organize it and classify it through systems, taxonomies, diagrams, atlases, field guides, etc. And one of the most famous natural histories is John James Audubon's Birds of America, published between 1827 and 1838, so over 10 years in the making. And when Audubon started out, many people doubted that this project would come to fruition. And that's because Audubon wanted to document not only all of the birds in North America, but he wanted to do so at life scale, including, like we saw just a few moments ago, really, really big birds. So how do you actually make a book big enough to accommodate this idea of representing every bird at life scale? It required using the largest handmade paper available at the time, and it was called double elephant folio. So a folio is like this big, a double folio is like this big, and a double elephant folio is this big, broadly conceived. I have a pretty big wingspan. But if you actually want exact numbers, think about 26 inches wide and about 38 inches tall. And once bound, these books get even bigger. So Audubon spent years in the American wilderness. He actually went out into different landscapes, and he was observing how these creatures behaved in landscapes like, I'm thinking estuaries and the Everglades into the Appalachian Mountains. And he was seeing these birds in really interesting and dynamic ways, like hunting prey and chittering together in little, I wouldn't say nests, but little bushes and things like that. But sometimes Audubon had to contort the birds in kind of strange ways, as you see in these pictures here. The flamingo is kind of accurate, but then you look at this whooping crane and you're like, something is a little bit off here. And so in order to fit these large birds right onto the page, sometimes he kind of had to squish them in odd ways, but he made it work sort of. And despite these odd poses that some of the birds were in, contemporary viewers praised Audubon for the hyper-realism of his drawings and his ability to capture the diverse splendor of American flora and fauna, which honestly, if you go back to the 1820s and 30s, the Western world didn't really know all that much about what was living and breathing and existing in North America. So let's move on here to this idea of how does Audubon achieve this brilliance, right? It's not a solo endeavor, not by a long shot. He worked with superb engravers like William Lazars and Robert Havell, who transposed his drawings, the ones he made in his studio, and they transposed them onto copper plates. And then there was this entire team of colorists, many of them were women and many of them unknown, who enlivened each and every print. So if you saw the gorgeous pelican in the previous display, that was all hand-colored. And like I said, hand-colored likely by a person that we no longer have a historical record for, but let's honor them, they're awesome. So creating such astonishingly large books with hand-colored plates was an expensive endeavor. So it was pretty common in the 19th century, especially in natural history works, to actually go out and get subscribers to the book. It's kind of like 19th century crowdsourcing, so like GoFundMe, essentially. Roughly 300 subscribers prepaid to receive plates in serial installments, about 5 plates at a time. And this gave Audubon the financial stability to actually go and make this book happen. These subscribers were almost always very wealthy individuals or institutions like the Library of Congress or the Smithsonian or Yale University. And about 200 complete folios were made, and about 100 of them exist to this day. There's roughly 435 plates per complete folio. We are lucky enough here at the Library of Congress to have 2 complete sets. One of them is bound into 4 volumes, and the other actually has been disbound, so we have individual plates that we can share with audiences through displays and things like that. And I bring up the ease of actually just showing one plate, because showing the book, or one of the 4 books, is really, really, really hard. Patrick and I I was working on a blog post for Bibliomania, the Rare Book Library, Rare Book Division blog post, and we carried one of these books down into the reading room, and I was like sweating profusely. I'm sweating, my arms are shaking, I hadn't been to the rock climbing gym in far too long, I was not fit to carry this volume, and I kept thinking, how much does this thing actually weigh? And in my mind, I was like, it's probably 30 pounds or something. And Patrick just kind of lovingly scoffed at me and was like, it weighs way more than 30 pounds. And I was like, well, let's get a scale and we'll weigh them. So we actually weighed every single one of our 4 bound volumes. And in total, they weigh 200 pounds. The largest volume, the one that you saw just earlier, weighs 55 pounds. So a pretty tall 5-year-old or something. I'm making that up, but I think that's how much I weighed at that time. And so all this talk about birds and things like that have me thinking about board games and thinking about Wingspan. And so I want to show you that I am no stranger to playing board games and no stranger to playing Wingspan. And here's just a little collage of images of me and my friends and the games that we've played over the years. And so tonight is a really special night to have Elizabeth Hargrave here. I think if you've been here with us throughout the day, you've seen that each one of these sessions is really tied to a personal part of our lives, of the team's lives. And I will say, as the nerdy new kid in the division, this talk is my nerdy passion. And we were really lucky because Elizabeth actually lives in the district, and so we were able to host her here in the Rare Book Division and spend a day looking at historic board games in our collections and also looking at some of the amazing natural history works that have inspired Elizabeth's board games and other people's board games. It was just a really cool moment for me, and it was really cool to have this moment with Elizabeth and our colleague Jackie. And so going back to Audubon for a moment here, you know, I think about Audubon and I think about all these natural scientists whose work are in our collections, and I see a parallel between their work and Elizabeth's work. Basically, they're both taking observation and transforming it into structure, right? Inviting audiences not only to look at and celebrate and enjoy nature, but to understand the systems that sustain our natural world. Elizabeth's games similarly translate ecological relationships into playable systems. She builds interactive models of interdependence, balance, and adaptation.
Thank you all very much, and thanks also to the Library of Congress and to Ashley. This has been an amazing event. I'm so glad y'all could come out for it. Now I just have to learn how to advance my slides. Okay. So I'm going to talk tonight about both games and nature. And I'm going to start out talking about how we've been doing these things both for a very, very long time. And then I'll spend the second half sort of talking about how I approach games and relate it back to some of those larger themes. People have been playing games for a really long time, and we actually have evidence going back because, and have been doing art about nature, I should say, for a very long time. Back to the Stone Age, we have little figurines that people carved of birds, often, or at least those are the ones I pulled and hear about. So 38,000 BC, there are little bird figurines from Germany, a little more recently in China. Y'all have seen like the cave art that involves animals, often related to hunting, but not always. But also playing games nearly as long. So there's a paper that recently was published where someone pulled a bunch of artifacts that had never really been articulated what people think the uses for them, and he's arguing that these were actually two-sided dice. There are games that are still played by some Native American tribes today that use this sort of system of throwing two-sided dice as a randomness mechanism, and these artifacts go back like 12,000 years. How many people have played Mancala? That game goes back at least to 500 BC in Ethiopia, but there are artifacts that have been found in Jordan that some people think are also sort of pre-Mancala, much, much further back. So that's a fun one because it's actually like a continuous play all the way through till modern time as well. Senet goes back to ancient Egypt. If you go to Labyrinth Games here in DC, you can buy Mancala, you can buy Senet. Still, people make replicas of these games. Go also, right? A very old game, still being played widely today. And in Central America and South America as well, there are board games that we know that go back thousands of years. This drawing is a depiction from, Spanish colonialists watching gameplay, but there have been these game boards found sort of implanted in the stucco of some of the Mayan ruins that go back much, much further. So those are all sort of game artifacts that have been found that are mostly in stone or bone, which are the things that survive that long. But then when you get into games that were made on paper, you get much more detailed art, and you start getting games that are about things. And you start seeing more nature in games. Playing cards go back probably to the 9th century in Asia, depending on how you count, but in Europe, probably 14th century. And this is a set of copper engravings for playing cards from the mid-15th century. And if you look at the suits, which were not our suits that we use today, they're things like lions and flowers and some weird, like, hoofed animal unicorn thing. And birds. There's a bird suit. And as printing evolved, the playing card decks got, more colorful, more diverse. This game is called the Game of the Goose, or in Italian, I guess it's the pleasant game of the goose. And it is the ancestor of many other games that follow this structure of sort of a spiral racetrack, rolling dice or other similar sort of randomness generators to just race, doing whatever the dice tell you. In the original Game of the Goose, when you land on a goose, it lets you go further forward. So it's a very helpful goose. But this is a popular game in its time, and it was played by royalty. It was gifted from country to country at an official level, apparently. There are historical records of this. But you will see this over and over in the history of games, this structure of the Game of the Goose. And this is one of them, The Wonders of Nature. It has a much longer name. But Edward Wallace and his father John Wallace were game publishers in the early 19th century, late 18th century in England. This is a game that would have been imported to the early United States and the British colonies. Well, no, because this was 1818. So it would have been imported to the early United States. It's showing locations around the world that were beautiful, natural locations, the wonders of nature. And it's really pointed to as an example of how printmaking was advancing in a way that made like more and more beautiful objects available to more people. What do we have? One of the natural wonders in that game is Niagara Falls. So let's zoom in a little bit on the US. And I'm going to go back to nature study for a minute. And really early nature study in the US, as Ashley was talking about, a lot of it was about sort of documenting all of the species in North America that no one had seen before, from all the European settlers had never seen before. Mark Catesby was one of the early publications to dive into the natural history of the East Coast of North America in 1771. And of course, with the Lewis and Clark expedition, they were not only mapping out the Louisiana Purchase, but they were documenting all of the species that they found along the way. They documented hundreds of species that had not had European names put to them yet. And then along comes Audubon, and before him, Wilson, whose book was also there, sort of trying to document specifically all of the birds, which Ashley went into great detail on. I have also never seen a roseate spoonbill in this position in my life. This is my favorite bird. The big birds are definitely kind of ridiculous, but it makes you appreciate, because those sheets of paper are already so big, and then these birds don't fit on them. They're just huge. And then in the 19th century also you get movements like transcendentalism, where you've got essayists sort of arguing for our connection to nature. And Ralph Waldo Emerson's feeling that by being in nature you were sort of this transparent eyeball that was experiencing the divine. And Henry David Thoreau, who goes back to the woods to live deliberately, right, and connect with nature. And in the late 19th century, early 20th century, you get also this movement of nature study, and people encouraging teachers and parents to help children connect with the natural world, not only as a way of learning the biology of the natural world, but really like this sense that it's good for you to connect to nature, that it causes delight and an abiding love of nature and companionship with life out of doors, and things like that. So flipping back to games for a second. This is the first game that we know to have been printed in the United States. So it is a map game, also a racing game. There's a little path that you can't really see on this picture where you're traveling from Washington, D.C. up through New England and over the Midwest and down to New Orleans is the final destination for some reason. And there's a whole booklet about all the different cities that you're stopping at along the way. Fun side note, dice were like verboten at this point in the U.S., literally sometimes outlawed because of the sort of puritanical, anti-gambling sensibilities of the time. But they made these items called teetotums, which it's a die, right? It's like, but somehow it didn't count because it's a little spinny top that then lands on a side that has pips on it. I don't know. So you spun your teetotum, your six-sided teetotum, and it told you how far to go. And in the advanced mode, you had to, the names of the cities are not on the map, they're just numbered. In advanced mode, you had to name the city that you rolled to be able to move forward. So it's very much like geography education game. And the company that printed this was actually not an officially games company, it was a cartographer that was printing maps and then made a game to help people engage with their maps. So this structure should look familiar. It's another game of the goose, but this one's called the Mansion of Happiness, 1843. This was originally a British game by a guy named George Fox, but it is the first game that was also mass-produced here in the United States. So the map game had many fewer copies. This was being, print runs of thousands at a time. And the innovation of this game over the game of the goose is that it is very much a game trying to teach morality. So instead of landing on happy gooses that help you go further forward, there are different spaces that have positive and negative sort of moral traits. So what is it? Prudence. If you land on prudence, you'll go a few steps forward. But if you land on the road of folly, it will send you backwards. And your goal is to make it to the middle of the board, which is the Mansion of Happiness and sort of religious utopia. The checkered game of life is very much in the same spirit in terms of moral teaching. It's from 1860 by Milton Bradley, whose name is probably familiar to many of you. He started a games publishing company. The thing that's interesting to me about the checkered game of life is that it sort of takes the moral teaching of the Mansion of Happiness, but it actually gives you choices. So you roll your teetotum, or spin your teetotum, and based on what numbers it gives you, you have choices about moving forward and backward, or left and right, or diagonally, which was a big innovation in gameplay, to have choice in your game. Go Milton Bradley. So the company actually, for the 100th anniversary of the Checkered Game of Life, commissioned a game that they called the Game of Life, which is the game that we grew up playing with the little car and the pegs in it that drives around on the road. That was the 100th anniversary of this game. In 1889, we get a game called The Office Boy. George Parker, future Parker Brothers, was not a fan of the moral teaching games. He, I think, thought they were a little too fuddy-duddy, and decided to start making his own games. So The Office Boy, I would argue, is still a moral teaching game, but it is teaching you how to rise through the ranks of a company. So you start out at the beginning of the track, you're applying for a job as an office boy, and you work your way up through being a traveling salesman and a manager, and then the spot in the center of the board is head of the firm. So more about financial success than moral success. 1910, you get the Landlord's Game, which evolved into what game? Yes. There's a whole book about that story. It's fascinating. I will not belabor the point, but Lizzie Magie designed the Landlord's Game as a teaching game, but not teaching us what Monopoly teaches us. It was actually sort of an anti-capitalist game about land distribution. But people just found the process of buying the land fun, and it eventually evolved into Monopoly through a lot of shenanigans that did not give her credit for many, many years. Moving sort of through the history of some significant American games, in 1954 there's a game called Tactics, which is the first really commercially successful war game that came out of the US, published by a company called the Avalon Game Company, which evolved into Avalon Hill, which is still going today, and just published one of my games this year. So that's a fun little point in the history. And then you get Sid Sackson and his game, especially Acquire. Sid Sackson was a prolific American game designer, definitely worth knowing. His other game that you should definitely know is Can't Stop. But over 100 games in his lifetime, starting in the 1940s up through his death in 2002. But Acquire is credited with being one of the first in a line of what came to be called Euro games, because this style became more popular in Europe than in the US. But games that were very low luck and sort of high player agency, like I was talking about, like where you have choices and your choices matter. There's no player elimination. Everyone has turns all the way through the end of the game. And it's very competitive. It's an economic game, but it's not violent, which is another thing that was very popular after World War II in Germany, especially. This game really took hold, and people credit it with being the beginning of a movement in Germany, especially. Some people came up calling Euro games German games because that was the heart of the industry. And then I'll skip forward to 2004 and Ticket to Ride, partly because this is an echo of that first American game that I showed you with that American map, right? You're building routes across this map, building trains. This is one of the most successful American games in that genre of what people call Euro games. And it's one of my entry points into the hobby of board gaming. I went to a weekend retreat where someone had brought a bunch of games, and I played Settlers of Catan and Ticket to Ride and Carcassonne all in one weekend. 3 of the main gateway games, at least at that time. But as I continued playing these games with my friends and many others in this genre, we started noticing that there's a lot of them that are in this sort of subject matter area of like trains and castles and colonialism. None of those really things that I like to spending my time thinking about. I don't know. And so I started to ask, what if there were games about things that I actually like? So now I will switch over to talking more about myself. I grew up outdoors. My family was a backpacking family. That's me on my dad's back in California, where I was born. We lived for a while literally in the middle of the woods on the edge of a state forest in southern Illinois. That's me on the day. And then moved to North Florida, which is just lush and beautiful. If you have only been to South Florida, it is completely different. Lots of live oaks and swamps and springs. And I also grew up Unitarian Universalist, which is the Transcendentalists are part of the lineage of that religious tradition. So the little thing in the middle is the 7 principles, one of which is respect for the interdependent web of existence of which we are all a part. And so I think that really informed my worldview and led to part of how I approached what games should be about. So 2013, I played all those board games that I just showed you. I started playing games in about 2005, and it was 2013 that I made my first prototype. Literally just pencil on paper. I was not familiar with the concept of fail faster at the time, but have since learned that I was a good engineer. It is the concept in engineering that you should just make a prototype of something. You can always iterate later, but you will learn much more by making the prototype than you can ever work out in your head. So fail faster, just make the thing. So that was 2013. Wingspan came out in 2019. It was about a 5 or 6 year process, me doing it as a side gig. And now in 2026, we are at the point that Wingspan has sold over 2.5 million copies. Which is pretty awesome. Thank you all. I'll talk a little bit about Wingspan for those of you who aren't super familiar with it. There's a deck of 180 unique bird cards. The base game is all North American birds. And every card has a power that makes you better at doing the things you need to do in the game. The brown-headed cowbird was one of the first birds that sort of inspired that part of the game as I was feeling out how it should work, because I always wanted the brown-headed cowbird to lay eggs in other birds' nests, which is a thing that they do in real life. And so it got the power that when other people are taking the action in the game of laying eggs, your brown-headed cowbird also gets to lay an egg. And then I had to, write a little thing on the bottom of the card to explain why it was doing that. And so now all the cards have fun facts on the bottom of them. And so there's a lot of information on every card. There's all of that I just described, but also the birds have their habitats and their food and their wingspans, and all of that comes into play in the game. So it's the kind of thing where no one has to actually remember any of the information, but there is a lot of information there to engage with if you want to. A lot of the information on the cards comes from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. They have an amazing website called All About Birds that has all the birds in North America and lots of information about them, all of the information that I just described. They also have a website called eBird that birders use to report birds as they find them, which is a big community science project, sort of tracking bird populations over time. Which I also use to sort of figure out what the most common birds are in different locations around North America, to make sure that I built a deck that looked like birds that people would expect to see. And fun fact about the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, it was founded around the same time that that Handbook of Nature study that I showed was published. And Anna Comstock was the first female professor at Cornell at the time that that book came out. So very much in that same sort of community science, nature education spirit. Cornell Lab also is the organization that puts out the Merlin app. If any of you have used that, I see a lot of nodding heads. Great app for identifying birds by sound. And in that sort of spirit of those amazing nature illustrators that we've been talking about, I wanted to highlight Natalia and Anna, who did all of the bird art for Wingspan. It was a lot. Imagine getting hired to sort of hone your craft like that for 180 illustrations. They did them in about 6 months. Some of the more detailed ones took a lot of time. I would highly recommend to any of you who appreciate the art on the cards to take the time sometime to look up. The originals are, you know, not huge, but they're definitely larger than the art on the cards, and they're really beautiful. They have prints for sale on their website, but it's also just a great way to browse the art in more detail. And if you're so inclined, there has been a book published of all of the bird art from HarperCollins. The other artist that was involved in making Wingspan, she did the player mats and the bird feeder and the card backs, things like that, was Beth Sobel. And if you ever see her name on a game box, it's going to be gorgeous. She does beautiful, most of the games that she illustrates are nature-themed games, and they're pretty great. All right, I want to spend the rest of my time talking about my approach to ideation for game design, and specifically about sort of these nature-themed games that I make. And I usually start with a cool thing in the world that I think people would want to know about. If I'm making the leap to, like, okay, this really is a game, it has to be something that I actually want to spend a good amount of time talking about, because remember I said Wingspan took me like 6 years. I've gotten faster, but it's still like a lot of playtesting, right? I get ideas from all over the place. But I want to talk, you know, a little bit more also about like what specifically is cool about the thing. Like birds are great, right? But what's the system there? And the inspiration from Wingspan was really like the idea that I had that the birds need resources, just like humans need resources in all the games that we make about human economic systems. And what would that look like in a board game? Or like Mariposas is about the fact that monarch butterflies migrate these amazing distances, and no single butterfly makes the round trip, and that's like mind-blowing. So the game system there, though, is like movement on a map, right? And how do you create incentives in the game to make people move the way you want to? I think about what your point of view is going to be as a player in the game. And how many people have played Catan, right? Like classic colonialist game. Hey, has anyone here played Spirit Island? A few people. So what's the point of view in Spirit Island? You're like the spirits of an island trying to get the Catan colonialists not to be there, basically, right? So the point of view really can matter in terms of how a game works. I'm going to go really quickly because I hear I'm running out of time over, there were a bunch of mushroom games that came out in the last few years, and I made one that's from the point of view of a tree. Someone else made one that's point of view of a mushroom. Other people made them that are point of view of like human mushroom foragers, right? So, oh, there we go. And that all influences, so like all these games came out at the same time, they play completely differently because of that point of view. There's a games philosopher named T. Nguyen, who I highly recommend. He has a couple books out, but also like if you can get a chance to watch a video of him speaking, he's a very engaging speaker. His philosophy reads like philosophy. But he's also a rock climber and talks about, like, if you want to get to the top of a cliff, you could just use a ladder. And the thing that makes rock climbing an interesting activity is the constraint that you're only allowed to use your own body to get up the side of the cliff. And there's a line of thinking in game design that it's often constraints that are what makes gameplay interesting, in a very similar way. And so, in undergrowth, you're a tree trying to establish your seedlings, but there's a constraint that to get the stuff you need, you have to make relationships with mushrooms. Versus in mycelia, you want to grow other mushrooms, but other players are kind of getting in your way. So there's different constraints in different games that really shape the gameplay as well. You might have to match seasons. In Wonderwoods, there's just a lot of hidden information about what's going on in the market. And I think also in natural systems about, like, what are the activities that you're doing in the actual natural system that might then translate into an activity that you could do in a game? So in undergrowth, playing from the point of view of a tree, things that you do as a tree, that trees do, are photosynthesizing carbon, making connections to fungi, trading for resources, using all of those resources to grow seedlings. Versus in mycelia, because you're a fungus, the activities are going to be things like releasing your spores, right? I think a lot about what games should feel like as I'm making them. It's not just to, like, make it and see how it works. Like, I'm trying to be intentional about how games make you feel. I think games can engender a lot of different emotions. These are just two that I picked as a couple spectrums, but games can be silly or serious. They can be aggressive or friendly. And, like, for those of you who know the name, these games, you're chuckling, right? Because these are, like, true differences between the games. And I put a couple of the mushroom games in here too. But I think there are things in nature that imply something about what a game should be like. If you were going to make a game about a blue-footed booby, it's not going to be a serious game, probably, right? And, like, platypuses are weird and probably silly, but also they have venomous spurs on their feet, so you could make an aggressive game about platypuses. That sort of thinking, right? And there's a lot of other emotions that I think we haven't even scratched the surface of in board games. I think about who a game is for. There's a great piece going on around social media right now, Rick Rubin saying, like, when you're making movies, you should be doing it for yourself, and that's what makes great art. But I think you can also think about other very specific people. And I do think it gives a game heart when there's someone specific in mind for the game. And I think that also can help steer your complexity. Like, when I made Sanibel for my dad, I wasn't going to make it a 3-hour Euro game about economics, right? Like, it needed to be simple. He wasn't a gamer. And there are things in nature that sort of imply where you should be on the complexity level as well. And so I sort of use those things to all add up to a vision statement about a game that I'm going to work on. So my game Sanibel just came out this year. It's about collecting seashells. It was inspired by my dad. It's for him. And you're literally walking down the beach, picking up tiles that look like seashells and putting them into a bag. The actions in the game very much mimic what you would do in real life, except that you have to do them on a tabletop, and that's my constraint for the puzzle of game design itself. But above all, games have to be fun to work, even if they're about nature. People don't care about, like, people ask me a lot about my games as educational games, and I have not thought of any one of my games as being an educational game. People have to have fun, and they don't care if you are trying to make them learn something. In fact, there is research that if they know you're trying to make them learn something, they will reject it and learn less. So there's a big difference from those 19th century games that I was talking about that were like shoving it down your throat. I try to put interesting information in there that people will want to engage with, but I never have anything in my games that requires you to remember any of it or think that it's interesting. The game has to be interesting on its own. But when it is fun, people do engage and they do remember. And I get notes from people all the time about birds that they have recognized in the wild because they played so much Wingspan that they knew what it was. I get people coming up to me all the time who say, I became a birder. People did today in the reception, I became a birder because of Wingspan. So I do think that there is power there that a lot of people designing board games have not really thought about. And it makes it a super interesting medium to me to be working in because there is so much engagement with the subject matter to be had. We're unplugging and sitting down with our friends, and it's just it's fun to be able to create something that people want to engage with in that way. So I will leave it there so that we have a little bit of time for questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah. How do you kind of set yourself apart when you're creating the games? Because it seems like, I don't know, as I get older, there's so many games out there. Like you go to Barnes & Noble, and there's a whole section of games, and there's so many varieties of games. So how do you kind of set yourself apart when you're coming up with a game?
Yeah, I think if everyone knew how to set themselves apart, then we wouldn't be setting ourselves apart anymore. There's thousands of games that come out every year. It's a really hard question. It's probably too many. The upside of it is that there's a game for everybody and every interest and every complexity level. So I think we're in a real golden age right now in that sense. But yeah, it is very hard to stand out. I did it by accident my first time with Wingspan, and I wish for it with every game that I've put out ever since, and I will never capture that lightning in a bottle again. I don't know.
So I'm not the biggest advocate for more screen time, as I'm sure everyone can relate, but have you considered digitizing or turning your Wingspan into a digital platform or any of your other games or something more for, the smartphone era?
Yeah, it's on every platform.
Oh, it is on every platform. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, excuse me. I apologize because I've been seeing only the board game version, I didn't know. Okay, so I'm gonna download it when. Yes, I'm obsessed with Merlin. Merlin is Pokemon Go for the real world, and yes. Okay, thank you. I apologize. I didn't know that.
No worries. Happy to spread the word.
I actually have a follow-up question to that, kind of tying into Mike Rogie, who was our previous speaker. He was very much rejecting the digital world. And I'm kind of curious, Elizabeth, if you feel like you have an affinity for one over the other, or if you kind of wish people would go to the physical board game, or you're like, hey, consume it in whatever way you want to consume it, whether it's in like this tactile way or on your smartphone. How do you think about like the digital board game world right now?
I think there's two pieces to that. I think play is a natural human drive, and digital play scratches that itch as in some ways as well as in-person physical analog play does. I do think there are things we get out of analog play that we don't get out of digital play. I think sitting down at a table with other people without your devices and just engaging in like a shared construct for an hour is of value in and of itself. And it's something that you don't get from engaging with playing against the computer.
Do you still play games for fun, or do you find yourself sometimes when you're playing a game overthinking the mechanics and how everything works together? And also, are there any more expansions coming?
I do still play for fun. I find it fun to learn new games all the time, and I don't get to do it as much as I would like because playtesting cuts into my game playing time. And I'm always looking at oh, what's the interesting thing about this game? How did they do that? But it doesn't kill it for me. I still enjoy it. There are more expansions coming. Yes. We're going to do every continent eventually.
When you play Wingspan, do you have a favorite strategy, like collecting eggs or the strategy cards when you play it?
I don't think you can decide ahead of time what you're going to do. I think you have to work with the cards you get dealt.
Jeff, okay, great. Here.
So when you play, do you always win?
No. No, I am not a great Wingspan player. I mean, I'll win against new people, but there's people that have played a lot more Wingspan than I have at this point. Yeah.
All right, I have a question along those lines. Okay. There are games that we are maybe naturally inclined toward, that we're good at, and games that we're not. How do you account for that? Or is there something that, if my kid is really good at Risk and I'm really good at Ticket to Ride, what does that say about us? How are we supposed to understand that?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. It makes me think. I talked a lot about Undergrove that came out a couple of years ago now, and when we were playtesting that, we were asking people as we went along, do you think this is more complex or less complex than Wingspan, to learn and to play? And we would get both answers. And I think some people's brains just work differently, and one felt easier or harder, or maybe if you've played a ton of Wingspan and this is new, it feels harder, that sort of thing. But I don't know what that is. Games have different systems in them, right, and different sort of building blocks. And if you're good at spatial reasoning, then some things will feel easier than if you're better at the math of engine building and resource trading and things like that.
I will ask the last question. I think, so I'm wondering, in your dream world, is there a game that you want to design at one point, but maybe there's something standing in the way? Oh, I want to do this so bad, but I'm afraid of X. Or I want to do this, but I don't know how to fix this kind of mechanic. Or what's your castle in the sky that you're reaching for?
I don't know. Mostly when I start working on a game, I just see it through and bust through all that. So I don't have anything in particular I do have one game that I sort of set aside because I have something else that I just started that I'm more excited about. And that one is definitely in that spot of I figured out how to solve the one problem, and now it needs one more thing. And I don't know what that thing is, and I'm just going to let it percolate for 6 months and we'll see.
I think that's a good lesson to take with us today as we think about the conclusion of our program, that sometimes you just have to let your ideas sit for 6 months or 10 years, and that's okay. It'll come to you at some point in time. But can we get a round of applause for Elizabeth?